Hey guys, in this video we are going to talk about the 5 common denominators of effective programming. I'm Adam Menner from Varsity House Gym and the Business of Strength. In this video we're going to talk about 5 principles that you should adhere to in your programming, right? All programming works to an extent if you ensure that you're adhering to really good principles. This could be individual difference, progressive overload, regressions, volume control, data collection, whatever the case may be. But we want to break down 5 commonalities that we have seen over the course of 15 years training athletes that have really affected the outcomes over time. It's no secret that we did a study that I've talked about multiple times in which an individual athlete improves by 4.8 to 8.4% no matter the level of training over the span of 13 weeks, our flagship program, Open Enrollment. And so I break that process down for you in this video, part of our free VH Speed series. I hope you guys enjoy. Like I've been saying, if you have any questions, comments, let us know below. We'd love to hear from you.
Lesson 3, common denominators of effective programming. This is probably the most tactical section of the programming lecture here, and this is where you guys are going to be able to really draw inferences and be able to apply these principles to what you guys do. So here was a cool picture that I put of Coach Jake, our Director of Performance, just going over different data and numbers that right there in real time of the different athletes who are sprinting. I think it's important here to note that all programming works. All programming works just in the confines of adherence and accountability, right? Adherence to a program is the most important training variable coupled with stress. I truly believe, as we talked about, the art in which you manage fatigue sequentially from phase to phase, cycle to cycle, is what's going to matter most. But when you look at all denominators of programming, whether it's block periodization, whether it's vertical integration, whether it's traditional linear periodization, they all have common factors. They all have a general prep period where we're building up GPP work. This is just non-specific to the task at hand. So I'm developing the physical qualities, such as in an accumulation phase. I'm just getting them stronger. I'm building technical capabilities. I'm building my aerobic base. These are all the things that happen generally. As I progress through the program during my power intensification phase, here is now where things begin to get more specific. I have less variability in my programming. I start to remove some of my aerobic work if I'm trying to improve speed and I'm focusing on the speed itself or that particular sprint variation through that distance. And now I'm removing things that are going to layer in more fatigue that I was purposely trying to induce during that general prep period. After my specific prep period, now what's going to happen, I am going to narrow in on what's called a competitive period. This is where I'm trying to get specifically good at the exact task at hand. If you're trying to improve a 30-yard sprint, everything is subsequently aligning with that 30-yard sprint. So now you can see when we talked about gravity and kinematics in that section of the course, this is why we like to layer in phases and segment the sprint into 4 separate sections. And under each phase, you're adhering to certain principles. You're adhering to aligning your strength and your power work. You're using ground contact as a reference time. You're making sure that all the exercises that you pick, that we're going to talk about in a little bit, are adhering to what portion of the sprint that you're trying to develop. Now, here at Varsity House, we have found that vertical integration works the best with team sport athletes because there are so many external and internal factors that we need to take into consideration when training these team sport athletes. You have athletes who play sports year-round. You have athletes that have a lot of external stressors that we cannot control. So the only way we can control this is by intentionally inducing stress and removing stress by our programming, by our volume, by our intensity, by our frequency, and by our exercise selection. Programming principles. Here are 6 programming principles that we have found that have elicited a good 4.8 to 8.4% of an improvement time and time again every 13 weeks. Number 1, ground contact time. As I alluded to before, using ground contact time during each segment of the sprint, your start, your acceleration, your attaining velocity, and your max velocity should be the universal reference point for all of the other physical qualities trying to be trained. The 4 phases of the sprint, the start refers to So section B here, programming principles. These are principles that we are trying to adhere to that have allowed us and have gotten the results of improving from 4.8 to 8.4% continuously every 13 weeks. So these principles, are not the be-all end-all, but these principles, however, are something that you should adhere to every single block of training in varying capacities, such as the vertical integration model that we just mentioned, to ensure that you're still training certain qualities but prioritizing certain ones over others. So here are the 6 that we have adhered to the most. Number 1 is ground contact time. Using ground contact time subsequently with point number 2 during the 4 phases of the sprint: the start, acceleration, attaining velocity, and max velocity, using ground contact time to improve all the subsequent physical qualities, strength, power, exercise selection during each segment, is what's going to allow you to ensure that you don't over fatigue or induce too much fatigue into these individuals, and that you can begin to, again, see adaptation from block to block. Number 4, long range of motion to short range of motion. This adheres to everything from kinematics in movement, from the sprint to power to strength. So looking at long ranges of motion to shorter ranges of motion. Back to principle 2, the 4 phases of the sprint: the start, acceleration, attaining velocity, and max velocity, right? In terms of inverse relationship between ground contact time and velocity as distance increases. We know that greater ranges of motion are experienced earlier on in the sprint. I'm at 90 degrees of hip flexion. As I transition through each phase, kinematically, my body goes through shorter ranges of motion, but I'm generating more force at higher velocities. So now I'm moving from long ranges of motion speed. That's also going to take place power-wise. So in earlier phases, my subsequent power variations should be unilateral, right? Because my unilateral variations, what I'm going to experience is longer ground contact times, more localized soreness, more inter and intramuscular coordination, and more stability at the locomotor apparatus that I'm using. So meaning if I'm at 90 degrees of hip flexion there, I know I'm going to get a lot of hamstring, I'm going to get some glutes, spini erecti, because I'm trying to get and develop force, right, to align with what's happening at that segment, which is acceleration with the start, torque, and force potential. As I move on, during we're going to talk about these in a little bit, power intensification phase, now my strength movements, right, are shorter ranges of motion, my power shorter ranges of motion, and then into my max velocity, shortest ranges of motion, matching the intensity of that force velocity curve. With my power, they're more elastic, less ground contact time. Number 5, here are 3 principles that I cannot state enough: short to long, slow to fast, and soft to hard. We're going to talk about these in our speed biomechanics section in the 5 governing principles of speed development. But when I look here, short to long, slow to fast, soft to hard, to reiterate quickly, short to long refers to distance to help mitigate fatigue and not get them running further and further to expose them potential chances of injury. Slow to fast is moving slow to fast. So training at sub-max capabilities and acceleration allows you to work on technical ability. Moving in soft to hard, this is also refers to impact and collision. Softer collisions in earlier phases of acceleration, because I'm not as forceful in regards to when I get further out into the sprint. So I'm going to utilize different exercises and variations that are not as forceful and impactful as they could be as I begin to progress. Now, lastly, principle number 6, aligning the weight room with your speed and performance. As I alluded to before, adhering to the long range of motion to short range of motion principle, I want to ensure that in the weight room, I am not counteracting what is happening on the field, what is happening on the court, if I am working, right, in a congruent speed program. For example, I would not have an individual do a full range of motion front squat, 5 sets of 5, during a max velocity phase. As you guys saw before, the PNS soreness the central fatigue output, the stress on the body is going to inhibit that individual from running max velocity throughout that week of that training cycle, right? I'm inducing stress at the wrong time within the training block. So these principles here, ground contact time, segmenting your sprints, adhering to longer ranges of motion to shorter ranges of motion, adhering to short to long, slow to fast, and soft to hard principles. Lastly, with aligning the weight room with your speed and performance are going to be the keys to long-term speed improvement. Now, breaking down a training block. So here's an example of our 13-week training block that we adhere to and what you should be focusing on in each training block, in each quality. Weeks 1 through 2. This is what we call our human healthy foundations. This is where we assess, acclimate, and onboard athletes. So during the 5 sections of testing that we talk about, this is where we are going to do all of that. I want to see in these first 2 weeks, what is your work capacity like? How can you move? I'm building and prepping all of my tendons and connective tissue. I'm getting them into different positions. I'm addressing compensations. And I'm assessing, I'm acclimating them to the way that we train inside the facility, the equipment, the space, the language. These are all the things that happen during these first 2 weeks. Week 3, testing and assessing. Now, yes, every single week you're taking times, every single week you're collecting data, but you need benchmarks of improvement. Just saying I improved my sprint from week 3 to week 4, there's not enough time there to be able to quantify and justify your findings. So we have a set in stone week 3 testing. This is where we do all of the 5 aforementioned tests from a speed and jump and strength profiling. So for different athletes, these are going to look differently. This is all about collecting the data. Now, weeks 4 through 6. This is our acceleration accumulation phase and developmental phase. This is all about building the engine, right? So earlier on, we're working on force capabilities. Like we talked about before, this is the start, this is acceleration. I'm trying to develop as much strength and force potential as possible. I'm trying to train at submax speeds via acceleration to develop the technical ability to express that new strength and force potential in later phases of the sprint. Now, moving on to week 7 and 9, this is where we're building power and explosiveness. This is our power intensification phase. So this is where we are layering in and we're working with ground contact time. We're working within the force velocity curve to now make our new engine, if you will, our new capacity to train. We're now trying to show and build power. So now we have more force potential. We are trying to express it by decreasing our ground contact times in all activities, whether that's the sprint by increasing distance, whether that's power by minimizing ground contact time with the exercise selection, and whether that's in the weight room with strength, where now the bar is going to be moving a little bit faster. The movements are going to be moved with a little bit more velocity. So you can see we're aligning everything sequentially. Now, weeks 10 through 11, this is truly where we're building speed and max.
What's going on, coaches and athletes? If you guys are enjoying this video, we have a ton of more content for free for you guys available. If you are an athlete, we have what's called our Athlete VH Performance Code. This is a free 13-week program that we've utilized here. Body weight, no equipment, adheres to real training principles. If you are a coach and you want to learn more about how we put together the training systems and implement the training principles that are taught on this channel, we have our free VH Speed and Performance System. This is exactly the breakdown and the layout that we use here for training athletes, as well as some stuff in there, as well as how we train adults in our training program as well. So you guys can find those 2 free resources. And if you're extremely interested in what we do, we also have our 5 steps to a results-driven training model. This is a paid product, but this is over-deliver. We gave a cool talk on July 8th of this past year, and you guys can find all of that information below. So right back to the video. We appreciate you guys.
Velocity. We call this our absolute speed realization phase. So weeks 10 through 11, we are trying to now capitalize on all of the strength, all of the power, and all of the technical ability that we just developed to allow these individuals to get frequent exposure to top-end speed. Week 12, this is retesting and assessing. Now we are comparing the data. So week 3 to week 12, that is a pretty good sample size. That is about 9 weeks of training. This is where we have concluded our 4.8 to 8.4% improvement over the span of 13 weeks. So each phase develops upon the next, even within terms of 3-week blocks within this example of a macro training block. Lastly, week 13, this is a pivot week. This is where we remove all of the stress that we've done. This is where we do different and fun things in our training to help stimulate the brain and provide a lot of variability. This is arguably the best week in terms of training because the guys knew they hit better numbers. The ladies, they also knew they hit better numbers. And we're gonna do fun and different things that they've never done. We're gonna challenge the nervous system, challenge stability, have them do fun, different challenges, right? To ensure that they're ready to go as we improve the next block. Here's something to note. Speaking of vertical integration, this is an example of something that we will go through with each athlete. However, depending on where they are in their season, we know that there's different seasons. You have our preseason, in-season, postseason, off-season. Each season has different demands and you need to adjust the volume accordingly. So when looking here, I know a couple things. One, I need to know where are they in season. I need to know number two, with their assessment process, where were they deficient in? Let's take 2 examples. Example A is an individual who lacks force, but they're a little bit more elastic and they have better max velocity capabilities. Well, then my building my engine phase and my acceleration is probably gonna go from weeks 4 to 9, and I'm gonna spend less time in my power, less time in my max velocity phase, because I know that is the physical quality that needs to be trained in order to continue to express and in order to continue to build acceleration to get to my max velocity quicker, because that's the physical quality that I'm good at. Now, inversely, looking at an individual, you have an individual who's very forceful. They have great peak force output, but they don't have great max velocity. Maybe they have a greater decreased rate of force in terms of their complete speed profile. So for this individual, I'm going to spend less time building our engine, maybe 1 to 2 weeks, and then what I'm going to do is spend more time on building that max velocity capability. I'm going to try to build in exposure to more higher velocity activities that are less in ground contact time, activities that are more max velocity. The third thing that you want to keep in mind here as you progress through is the principle of vertical integration. Because I am working on one, in terms of if I am working on acceleration, that doesn't mean I don't expose them to max velocity. That doesn't mean I don't expose them to different variations in terms of if I'm developing power with speed, or with strength in terms of acceleration. So I have varying degrees of what I'm building, but their one physical quality should be prioritized while maintaining the other. So this is an example of a macro training cycle that we use here at Varsity House, but this is a great way for you guys to organize your speed and performance program. Moving on to phase segmentation of the sprint. Now we are going to deep dive what happens in each phase. So we know there's 3 of them: acceleration accumulation, power intensification, and absolute speed realization. So during acceleration accumulation, here's what we know. The longest ground contact times because of the kinematic position of my body. We know I am experiencing late stance propulsion mechanics, so looking biomechanically what's happening, I'm on my toe, I'm on the forefront of my foot, so that's going to affect my orientation back to pelvic variability. I know that I'm getting more concentric contraction because of my range of motion, right, in the kinematic position of my body, so I'm driving my leg back as opposed to in top speed where my center of mass or my leg is coming outside my frame, striking the ground, and then my body's eccentrically loading as my hip gets over my foot, which is called my touchdown phase. I know that I'm experiencing greater ranges of motion, so this is 90 degrees of hip flexion, so this is going to be a lot of posterior hamstring glute activity. Now, this is where we should incorporate more multi-directional start-based variations. Why is this? Because as I reach biomechanically more top speed variations, I know that the pelvis needs to go through various phases of anterior pelvic tilt and posterior pelvic tilt. Those 2 things are going to play a role. So I know I need a lot of anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt as I'm sprinting, because there is no true neutrality as it comes to performance. It's all about what is needed to perform the task at hand, or what is this individual just good at individually. The multi-directional starts, though, will allow for different variations of the pelvis to move through. A 90-90, one side of the pelvis is anteriorly tipped, one is posteriorly tipped. Now they have to overcome gravity and they have to move sequentially, right? Or if I'm doing a lateral start, now I'm going to get an external rotation of one of my femurs while the other one is internally rotated. So I'm taking my pelvis through triplanar variations to help improve mobility through performance, or I should say improve movement capacity through performance. More closed change direction work. So when looking at change of direction, we know that change of direction and agility kind of encompasses a lot of different things here. And Ian Jeffries in Game Speed explains what are the true physical qualities of agility. But one of the things that agility we know, referring back to ground contact time, is this specific athletic action requires you to spend more time on the ground. It's a more acute force. Therefore, there's more susceptibility to injury if the body is not prepared for this change of direction, if the body does not have the movement variability via our pelvic mechanics, thorax mechanics, to be able to handle those abrupt changes of direction and to be able to handle the collision that is experienced in those direct changes of direction patterns. So we want to start very small to align to ground contact time, spend more time on the ground, develop the capacities by going through a true progression, which we're going to show in a little bit. Lastly is our weighted unilateral jumps. Right? We know that we're trying to develop force capability and work capacity and also localized tissue soreness via PNS fatigue and less CNS fatigue. So we're trying to accumulate a lot of volume here to build our engine. So we like to use unilateral variations in earlier phases to help further along the progression of a development. When we look here at segmenting part number 2, this is power intensification. So now what's happening here? We look at our segmentation of the sprint. What we have is shorter ground contact times. So this is power intensification in terms of now we're moving from longer ground contact times experienced earlier on to now shorter ground contact times as we make our way up the force velocity curve. So now we have greater output, right? Greater force experience. We are generating almost 6 to 7 times our body weight as we reach our 6 through 10 stride. So we know that that is a lot of force moving at higher velocity. Now we want less variation. So we're moving from our general prep period down to our specific prep period. In our specific prep period, what's happening here now, we want to now get rid of those triplanar movements. We want to now get rid of maybe some different things in the weight room that we're utilizing that will induce more fatigue, such as more supplemental work, pressing, pulling, unilateral work, because we're going to focus more on output. Now, when we look at less range of motion for lower body, we're looking at matching what's happening kinematically during the sprint and during jumps when our ground contact time is less. So now in the weight room, I'm going to pick more bilateral movements. I'm going to pick exercises such as a higher box squat, or maybe I'm going to pick a higher pin pull off the ground. Maybe I'm going to pick a lunge variation where they don't need to bring their leg all the way down, so my output is a lot higher and I'm traveling less distance kinematically in the weight room. Now we're going to utilize less unilateral work because we don't want as much localized soreness and muscle damage at each joint or at each muscle around our lower limb, because that's going to contribute to PNS fatigue. Greater PNS fatigue while performing high coordinated activities, higher velocity based activities such as sprinting at max velocity can actually do more harm than good, and now we're putting ourselves at a chance of getting hurt. And again, this is not directly correlated, but we do want to avoid those situations as much as possible. So in power intensification, ground contact time is going down, output is improving. We're trying to get rid of less variation, more specificity in terms of exercise selection. We're matching the ranges of motion in the weight room that are experienced on the field. We're incorporating more bilateral work to help match force output, because we know that there's more force output with bilateral work than there is with less unilateral work. So this is power intensification. Lastly, for phase segmentation, part 3, what we're going to accomplish here, we need to know that this is the shortest ground contact time experience. So this is the most speed, this is at the highest velocity, but also at the most force. So now we're really dealing with more nervous system fatigue than we are with peripheral nervous system fatigue. So I want as little variation as possible. I want to be extremely specific. And now all the things that happen in the weight room, such as my supplemental exercises, maybe my sensory motor exercises, anything that's going to induce more stress and fatigue on the muscle, I'm going to get rid of. So I'm trying to decrease volume entirely so that they can focus on one thing, expressing their true speed that we spent the last 2 phases developing. In the weight room, we're going to experience our shortest ranges of motion with our lower body movements. So this is where we're going to do extremely high pin pulls, maybe extremely high box squats, or I might remove all lower body movements entirely from the weight room and just do very ballistic power-based movements that match what's happening with my speed work. Now, something to note here, and we've talked about it. This is why we perform a lot of singles in the weight room at this particular time. We perform singles for upper body for full range of motion, but for singles with lower body with our shortest range of motion. Here's why. For our upper body, we need a lot of arm drive to help counterbalance us and decrease air time as we progress through the sprint. So a single is highest intensity, but I'm also developing the most absolute strength with that range of motion. So now I know that I'm getting greater ranges of motion at each endpoint with my arm drive through the sprint because I am my strongest. Furthermore, with a single, it's the most neurologically taxing. So I am matching what's happening neurologically in terms of output and motor units used for the sprint with the weight room. So I'm marrying the two. Lastly, for range of motion with our lower body, we're experiencing the less range of motion because we want to overload that position. The athletes are going to be able to use the most weight with the shortest ranges of motion, but that's designed intentionally to help with total output, to help the body prep for the forces experienced at max velocity and top speed. So here are the key points here for our absolute speed realization.